Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graben. Our guest today is Kerry Siggins. She is the CEO and executive chair of StoneAge Holdings, a fast-growing manufacturing and technology company based in Colorado. So under Kerry's leadership, StoneAge has experienced double-digit growth year over year. In 2015, she successfully transitioned the company's ownership structure to an ESOP, an employee owned program that we'll talk about later in the episode, ensuring that all employees share in the success of the company through that employee ownership. Kerry's a board member and business advisor. She's a speaker who presents worldwide at conferences and universities and different corporate settings. And she also, like me, hosts several podcasts, including the wildly popular podcast Reflect Forward. And like me, she's an author. Her book is The Ownership Mindset. So, Carrie, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And grammatically, I hope I didn't make a mistake. The things that I'm saying we have in common are a podcast and a book. What we don't
Yes.
have in common is your CEO experience, just to be clear.
Do you want it? Do you want my job? Sometimes I'd be happy to just hand it over.
That might be a mistake. But Carrie, we're going to be able to talk about the culture and ownership culture and learning from mistakes within your company. So I'm excited to talk about that. But first, as always, the main question we always start with here, with the different things you've done in your career, Carrie, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Oh, gosh. So it actually comes before, in my career, but it's not career related. But
Okay.
it has had a tremendous impact on my career. So in my 20s, I developed substance abuse issues.
Oh.
And it was due to a lot of reasons that I've done a lot of coaching and therapy around, but,
Mhm.
combination of insecurity, imposter syndrome
Mm.
combined with a lot of drive and ambition, and this feeling that I had to pretend I was somebody else to be lovable. And
Mm.
it fueled all kinds of issues for me. And on Labor Day of 2006, I accidentally overdosed.
Oh my gosh.
And that set my life onto an entirely different trajectory. And so, I have a lot of gratitude for those times in my life because it was a huge inflection point for me. It brought me here to Durango, Colorado, where I live now, and on
Mhm.
this leadership path that I'm on. But it was a huge mistake that I made in my life, and lots of little mistakes that added up and compounded and led to really hitting complete rock bottom and having to rebuild my life from that.
Wow. See, this is what happens when I don't know the story in advance. I'm thankful and impressed that you would share that story. That's not a story a lot of people would be willing to share. So first off, thank you for doing that.
Thanks. Thanks.
Um, was that overdose? I mean, it sounds like that's not always a wake up call
Yeah.
for people when it comes to addiction, right? Can you? I'm curious if you can talk through how you were able to bounce back and make that a step toward recovery.
Sure. So for me, so I had high functioning substance abuse issues. I call myself a high functioning addict, like many high achievers that I've learned now can be. And so it wasn't almost dying that was what made me decide that I was going to choose living over dying. It
Mhm.
was that I couldn't go to work.
Yeah.
So even though I had been, things were getting worse and spiraling out of control in my life, I always, always, always went to work. I was very ambitious, very driven, very driven by the need to make sure people saw me as successful. And so I couldn't go to work for 3 or 4 days afterwards. And that was rock bottom for me.
Mm.
And I just realized that like all of this success that I was trying to portray, it was all fake. I was a
Mm.
fraud, basically. Is that
Mm.
yes, I was smart, and yes, I was driven, and yes, I was building my career, but I wasn't thriving. I was living way beyond my means, and I was spiraling out of control into addiction. And so the really what it was that I knew that I had something in me to do something to make a big impact in my life. And I wanted to do that. And I realized that the path I was on, I was going to not live up to that potential. And quite frankly, maybe not even live. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I wanted something more with my life. I wanted something more with my career. And that shame that I felt and how much I hated myself for not being able to go to work while I was recovering from the overdose. That was the turning point for me. There was obviously lots of steps that had to happen afterwards for me to be able to change my life. And it took me a couple of years to like truly get clean.
Hmm.
But that was it. That was the point.
Yeah.
I go to work. I always go to work, and I couldn't go to work.
Yeah. And what was your work at that point in your life?
So I was in sales. I was in. So I have an engineering degree and a business degree from Colorado School of Mines, and I had spent some years in technology, but I'm really a salesperson at heart, and so I
Hmm.
had moved into technology sales, and I loved selling. I just wasn't working for a company that was a great fit for me,
Hmm.
and so that was also part of it. But yeah, I was selling software in Austin, Texas.
Yeah. And this is out of my depth of things that I normally ask about. So I guess I'll come back
You can
to
ask me anything. I get to.
well,
I'm not embarrassed about this. I talk about
no,
it in my book. Like, sorry, I
yeah.
didn't mean to
Oh,
shock you with my
well, no,
story.
it's just it's harder for me. It's just not it's not a matter of discomfort with the story. I'll fall back, I guess, on some of the typical questions, that I
Yeah.
ask about, discovering a mistake and deciding to take action. I mean, but before the overdose, had there been inklings or thoughts around, okay, I should stop, I should get help, or was it just something you didn't think was a problem at that point because you
Oh,
were able to
yeah.
function and go to work?
Oh, I knew it was a problem,
Yeah.
and I knew that it was getting worse, and I knew that it was affecting my performance, but I was too ashamed to admit it, and just like too deep into it to make that change. Something like this is. I think it's what had to happen to help me figure out like you're going to go on this whole different trajectory. Um, but yeah, I knew that it was getting bad, and I knew I was getting out of control, and I had so much shame around it. But that's the hard part of addiction. Like, substances make you love the life that you hate and hate the life that you love. And I was so in that spot. And even though I wanted to make a change, I didn't have, I always thought it was about willpower. Now I understand so much more about how the brain works and what addiction does to you. And that's not just addiction to substances. It's addiction to work. It's addiction to exercise, to food, to gambling, right? What dopamine and serotonin, and how that affects your brain. I didn't have any of that understanding then to realize that I wasn't just a weak person. It's
Mhm.
not really just about willpower. But I didn't know how to change it. So yeah, I knew that I was not doing well and I was not thriving, but my ego wouldn't let me,
Yeah. I mean,
say otherwise.
did you have a boss or others at work who might have thought, "Hey, Carrie, is everything okay?" Or
So yeah, so it had been going on for about 5 years, and when I left Denver, I knew my boss knew that I was struggling, and I loved him. He was my favorite boss. I was right out of college. I was working for an engineering company. I did not like what I was doing. I have an engineering degree, but I'm not an engineer. Like, I was not supposed to do that work. Like, I don't design anything. Don't walk on anything I design. Uh, don't use anything I would design. And he was really supportive. But he never said, are you okay? And
Mhm.
it's not a boss's place to necessarily do that, right? You always worry about those boundaries. I do sometimes wonder, like, if he would have just said, like, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
If I would have told him, and if it would have been different, because that was in the very beginning of my issues. But he didn't, and
Mhm.
actually, it's that experience because I love him so much. I loved him to this day. It's made me think about how I engage with people who I know are struggling, because almost everybody's struggling with something.
Mhm.
Some obviously goes deeper than others. I would say that in Austin, towards the end, I was not performing well, and I think that my boss understood that. He had no idea what was going on. By that point in my career, I was really good at being able to hide it.
Hmm.
So I didn't have any, I was professional. I was doing my job, but things were definitely slipping there in that last 6 months.
Hmm.
So I think he knew that something was going on, but not to the depth of what was going on.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hmm.
So it sounds like there's some advice there for a manager. That's it's okay to ask, I guess, the general question: Are you okay? Your
Absolutely.
performance seems to be struggling. I mean, not that the manager is going to fix it, but I think in a lot of companies, somebody could be pointed to a confidential employee assistance
Exactly.
program, or I mean, like they're. I mean, I'm sure. Yeah, it's an awkward thing to bring up. It's not going to be so
Yeah.
direct. Like, are you an alcoholic, or are
No.
you using drugs? But just the are you okay?
Yeah. And I think so much
Right.
has changed, right? It'll be 18 years in September of this year. And so much has changed around mental health now. And I do think that there's not nearly as much stigma around mental health issues that lead to, various types of substance abuse or addiction or self harm or all of those things that happen. Or simple things like anxiety and
Mhm.
burnout, which are all very real. So I think that in my experience, it's easier today to have these conversations with employees because there's not so much stigma around it. I think there's a lot more training around how do you help people who are struggling. We have to, as leaders, we have to help our employees. So many people are dealing with mental health issues and mental health crises and really struggling, and we can't just write them off, right? They are good people, great employees who are going through a rough time.
Mhm.
And so, just even having a manager, a boss who says, hey, I care enough about you to ask, like, I
Mhm.
can't be that person who helps you fix it, but I can
Right.
be the person who helps you go get the help that you need. And we're going to support you as a company while you go through this. I've
Mhm.
seen time and time again here in my experience of running StoneAge for 17 years now. I've seen how it pays off when people know that their boss cares and the company has their back, they can get through tough times.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to hear then, kind of the path beyond that. I'm trying to do the math. Well, I can do the math of 17 years at Stone Age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how and where, or not where, but how did you end up there? And did you start off hired into a certain role or as
Yeah.
CEO?
No, not a CEO. So after I had enough strength to get up and like, okay, I got to figure out what I'm going to do because this is not the life I want. I called my mom and I told her everything, and I asked if I could come home. I was like, I got to get out of Texas. I need to rebuild my life. I just know that I have so much more potential than what I'm doing, living my life like, and luckily she said yes, come home. And home is Durango, Colorado. I grew up about 2 hours north of here. My mom had moved here in the early 2000s. And so I had no idea what I was going to do. Durango's a small mountain town.
Mhm.
It's beautiful, but it's a service industry. I had a lot of debt, and I was really nervous about being able to find a job that would be able to, I could be able to function on here. But I knew
Yeah.
in my heart I needed to go home. So I went home, and I left about 6 weeks after. So I moved here November 4th of 2006, and I started applying for jobs.
Mhm.
And StoneAge was looking for a general manager. It was a tiny little company at the time, about 8 million in revenue. The two founders also, what they met at Mines. One's a mine graduate, one was a research assistant there, and I had done so many of the roles that the general manager was going to oversee that I said, you know what? I'm going to apply for it. And even though I'm underqualified and I probably won't get it, maybe it's my foot in the door for another
Mhm.
position there that I'm, more qualified for
Yeah.
from my experience perspective. And I met with the founders and I met with the management team, and they decided to take this huge risk. Now, none of them knew this story. Remember, I'm high
Mhm.
functioning. And by this time I'm,
Right.
I'm relative, like I'm in a much better place.
Yeah.
And they decided to take this huge risk and hire me.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know about my story until much later. I did not share it openly until about 3 years after I started at StoneAge.
Yeah.
But yeah, here we are now. 17 years later, and we're almost $100 million in revenue. And
Yeah.
that's why it's my favorite mistake. If that
Yeah.
would not have happened, if I would not have hit rock bottom, I would have never come back home and found this amazing company and now been able to take over leading it and growing it and turn it into an employee owned company. So that's why I
Yeah.
had to share the story, because it's literally
Yeah.
the reason why I'm sitting right here doing what I'm doing
Yeah.
today.
Well, I'm glad there was that silver lining
Yeah.
to
Yeah. It's
lead.
not like that for everybody.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's good that you were able to make that transition, and going back home probably provided some additional support and get things on that track. And so tell us a little bit about StoneAge Holdings. And we described it generally as a manufacturing and technology company. I'd love to hear more about what the company does, and maybe kind of weave in your story to then moving up to become CEO.
Sure. So StoneAge Holdings is new. We just created a holding company about 3 years ago because we are executing an acquisition strategy and want the employee ownership ESOP, the employee ownership plan, to be available for all employees. The core business manufactures industrial cleaning equipment, so high pressure water blasting tools, high tech squirt guns on steroids, basically.
Yeah.
When I came on, we were making the nozzles that go on the end of hoses, and this is not like applications like your pressure washer that you use at home. These are ultra high pressure applications that are used in industrial facilities. So, the water coming out of let's say a nozzle coming out of a car wash is at 700 psi. Our tools go up to 40,000 psi. So ultra high pressure, cleaning refineries, petrochem plants, food processing plants, anywhere you'd use ultra high pressure water to clean, which is most of the world. And then in about 2013, we started making semi-automated equipment that gets the user, the operator, away from the cleaning surface. Water jets are very dangerous; they can kill you. And now we're making robotic equipment that can clean autonomously. And so we're building software platform. We collect data, IoT enabled products, basically. So we've really transitioned the company from making these mechanical based tools to now electrical mechanical tools that are driven by software. Okay. So that's what we do. Mm-hmm. I became CEO about 3 years after I started with StoneAge. So I led us through the 2008-2009 crisis with a lot of luck, because I did not know what I was doing. Just taking the core things that we were good at and making sure we were focused on those. And we came out of that really, really in a good spot. And so that's when the board promoted me into CEO. And so that was at the end of 2009. Yeah. So I was about 30. I think I was like 31 years old at the time. And then I had to figure out how to be a CEO from there.
Yeah. So. And that's young to be a CEO of a company you didn't found, right?
I know. No. Yeah. Yep. It's interesting though. I feel like, it's my company. And John and Jerry, our two founders, are just, they have this incredible vision of sharing the success of the company with the company, and started this employee ownership program. And then ultimately I led us through the ESOP transition. And I've been working with them for so long. They're out of the bolt. Well, one is an engineer in the business. The other one is on our board, but pretty much doing other things. I've built such a relationship with them. It was really the three of us that partnered to grow this company from what it was to what it is now. And so to be a CEO hired in, I can't imagine that anybody feeling more like it's their company than I do. Yeah. I've really been able to take it on, and now that it's employee owned, it's all of ours. Yeah. And so it's a really great structure. And I feel like, I founded it, but only after it was about at 8 million, because we've gone through so much change in these last 2 decades.
Founding the new version.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's interesting. A lot of companies talk about, they want employees to think like an owner. I'm like, yeah, but they're not. You might not be giving them much incentive. I think are you a fan of the movie Office Space?
Oh, yes.
Or those
The
consultants are
show.
talking to
Yeah.
Peter
Yeah.
Gibbons, and he says
Yes.
something like, "It's a matter of motivation. If the company does better, I don't see another cent." And like, it's something. I mean, it's funny because it's true.
Yes.
Um, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on not just thinking like an owner, but the benefits of the employees being owners. And ESOP stands for Employee Stock Ownership
Plan.
Plan. Okay, I was going to say program plan. But yeah, I mean, tell us more about that. How it's not just lip service and
No.
actual ownership. Why that matters so much.
Yeah. Yeah. Ownership absolutely matters. And I hear all kinds of CEOs say, I want ownership thinking within my organization. But they don't necessarily create the environment where ownership thinking is rewarded. And I'm not just talking about with true ownership in the company, but I'm talking with trust and autonomy and
Mhm.
decision-making authority, and care and those types of things where people feel like, hey, I am here for more than just a paycheck. I'm here because I have purpose and meaning in my work. And if you can create that kind of environment, you do develop ownership thinking where people really feel like, I own my role and my contributions to the company. But that takes a special type of leadership and really very intentional culture curation to develop
Mhm.
that. It happens over time. It's not just going to happen like that. And you have
Right.
to teach people how to do that. But when you add employee ownership on top of it, where people actually get to benefit from their work, it's incredibly powerful. I mean, we have people here who've worked here for almost since the company's inception, and we have very low turnover, and that's part of our culture because it is such an engaging place to work, and we do help our employees find purpose and meaning. But through the employee stock ownership plan, they also get ownership. So
Yeah.
how it works, I'll just explain it briefly. It's very complicated, and not for everybody, but
Yeah.
employee ownership is definitely everything a leader should consider. But in ESOP, basically what happens is the company creates a trust, and the trust buys shares from shareholders, so buying out our founders and other employees who had bought stock in the company. But mostly, it's coming from founders. They buy out those shares, and
Hmm.
then that trust is managed by ERISA and the Department of Labor. So it's actually a qualified retirement benefit. We do not talk about it like that because no 22-year-olds like talking about retirement. We talk
Right.
about it as an ownership structure, but basically, what happens is every year shares are put into an employee's account, and those shares, the share price, as the company grows and the shares increase in value, then that's how the employee builds wealth. And then every year they get new shares into their accounts as well. When they leave the company, it's theirs. How you maximize it is
Hmm.
you roll it into an IRA and you don't touch it until retirement.
Hmm.
But if you say want to go start your own business or buy a house or send a kid to college or go spend it on whatever you want, you just pay a tax penalty on top of it. So
Yeah.
it's ultimately your money when you leave. So that's how it works. So it's really maximized if you look at it as a long-term ownership investment,
Right.
and don't touch it until you retire. But
Hmm.
ultimately, it's the employee's money when they leave the company.
Yeah. And I mean, being a privately held company, then, I mean, how does the valuation of the shares work or change over time?
So every year you get an outside valuation,
Hmm.
and that's how the stock price is set, and that's how you understand what's in your account, and
Hmm.
also the stock allocation. So it's a
Yeah.
pretty intense process that you go through with the valuation every year, but it's an independent. So it's not there's no funny stuff going on with the company creating its own valuation, and so that's what happens every single year.
Yeah. And then when somebody retires or has an ability, if somebody works for a company, public company, where they're granted shares or options, those can be sold once they vested pretty easily.
Mhm.
For something like an ESOP and somebody retires, do those shares get bought back by that trust to then be allocated to
Yes.
other employees? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That's typically
Yeah.
what happens. Some ESOPs let their employees who leave keep the shares. It
Hmm.
really depends on the situation of the company.
Yeah.
Every ESOP plan is different.
Hmm.
Ours, though, we only want current employees to hold shares. So yes, we would buy out the exiting shareholder, and then they would roll that cash into a 401k, or I'm
Okay.
sorry, into an
Yeah.
IRA.
IRA.
But
Mhm.
yeah, but it depends on how the plan is set up. But that's typically
Okay.
how it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then are there also, I mean, companies can do profit sharing without
Mhm.
an ESOP. Is there
Mhm.
something based on company performance and goals that
Mhm.
gets paid out to help build on? I mean, purpose and meaning are important, but you can't pay the bills or buy, take a vacation off, self actualization and meaning. So, I mean, is there also a connection to some incentives and some payouts just
Yeah.
to strengthen that feeling and teamwork as a company?
Yeah, so we offer profit sharing as well. I would say that's less common to have both an employee
Oh,
ownership
okay.
plan and a profit sharing plan. A lot of people who want to start this idea of ownership thinking and sharing in the success of the company start with a profit sharing plan, which is what we did years ago before I came on to StoneAge. It's the easiest way to get people starting to think about the bigger picture rather than just themselves.
Hmm.
So our benefits package offers a competitive salary, plus profit sharing, plus an opportunity for an annual performance-based bonus that still
Hmm.
has, the profit sharing is bigger than that because we want this one team mentality, but we also want to be able to create reward individual performance as well. And
Hmm.
then we have the ESOP, and we also do a 5% match on a 401k for anybody putting in 4%. So we're very, very big on
Hmm.
helping employees create wealth. So we personally have a very generous package that takes into account both, cash, current year cash, and the short term and longer term incentives.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And not to get too sidetracked on this, but I live in northern Kentucky, and they're very smart. One exit across the border from Ohio is the country's largest liquor store.
Yeah.
And the sign not only touts that they're the largest, but the sign as you enter actually touts that it is an ESOP corporation, and that you're not only supporting a local business as the retailer, but the employees
Yep.
as owners. And I think for a business founder, that's one way to exit your business and sell it and keep it
Mhm.
in good hands. The long story short is that the founder wanted to build a distillery in the parking lot and was legally not allowed
Yep.
to own a retailer and a distillery, so he sold the company to his employees, which
Oh, well, that's such a cool story. Yeah.
yeah.
I checked them out after you told me when we first met. So I went on to their website because I was just fascinated to go see this like humongous liquor store. But yeah, that's really great. There's a lot of people, they don't understand it. They don't understand it's an option. And it is very complicated, and setting up an ESOP can be expensive.
Mhm.
And a lot of people maybe haven't had a positive experience with it. So they're like, oh, my brother-in-law had a, lawyer says don't do that. So they don't. But
Yeah.
there's been so much. I mean, at the state level, depending on where you're at, the state level and at the federal level, there's so much going around employee ownership. I'm highly involved in Colorado's employee ownership ecosystem. I sit on our governor's commission for employee ownership. Colorado's leading the way in supporting employee-owned businesses,
Mhm.
and helping create transactions to incentivize people. We've
Yeah.
passed 3 legislative bills to incentivize people considering selling to their employees. But now we're doing a lot of work at the federal level as well.
Mhm.
And it's one of the very few bipartisan issues that are out there. Everybody can agree that worker, people build the average worker building wealth is a good thing.
Right.
There's a big focus on manufacturing because obviously we want to keep manufacturing jobs here in the
Mhm.
United States. So
Yeah.
there's lots of things that are happening around it in the ecosystem. So anyway, if there's any business owners listening to this and who are thinking about an exit strategy, ESOPs, or any kind of, there's other ways to do employee ownership too besides just ESOPs. ESOPs are just the
Yeah.
most commonly known ones, but it's a really great way to to leave a legacy behind, to share in that success with the people who helped you build your company, for you to exit and feel good about it, and maintain that company in the community that you built it in.
Yeah. And do you, so Carrie's book is The Ownership Mindset. Is this covered to some degree in the book, or would you point
A
somebody
little
to
bit.
a detailed
Yeah.
book on employee stock
Yeah,
plans? Or
my
yeah.
book is not. I talk about what it is at a high level, but the book is part memoir, part leadership book, part how to build a really great team culture or company culture.
Hmm.
But there's lots of great resources that are much more technical and in depth than my book.
Hmm.
So there's where I would send people is to the National Center for Employee Ownership, the NCEO, nceo.org.
Hmm.
Everything that you would possibly want to know is there. It's an awesome resource, and they're really the go-to organization. So that's where I would send people if they were interested in learning more. The biggest thing is if you want to go down this path, hire people who know what they're doing. A lot
Hmm.
of times people will go like, okay, I'm going to work with my accountant. My accountant, he can figure this out, or my lawyer, she can figure this out. And no, it's very complicated. And the best thing that you can do is go talk to experts. There are lots of them out there.
Hmm.
But you want to make sure that you do this right, because if you don't do it right, it not only affects you, but it impacts every single one of your employees. And so you want to work with experts.
Mm. So, when you think of mindsets and the ownership mindset and culture, I love what you said about culture taking time. Words like curate, or in my book, I use the word cultivate
Yep.
in the subtitle. Even though now I think about curating culture has a better ring, cultivating culture is a little clunky. So
That's why I do. That's why I use curate. It's the right
maybe
word.
maybe that was a mistake. It's an ongoing thing. But one element of your culture I wanted to touch on, because of the theme of the podcast here, is thinking through how you and other leaders react when employees make mistakes.
Mhm. Yeah, so I look at it as a gift. None of us ever do things like well in life and go, "Oh, I learned so much from that."
Yeah.
Every time I have an inflection point, or my leadership ability, or my CEO fitness or skills have always grown from making mistakes, of going
Hmm.
like, "Ooh, that didn't work like I thought it was going to. How do I make sure that doesn't happen again?"
Yeah.
So we really celebrate it here. Actually, our mantra is here. The goal is not to avoid problems. The goal is to root them out as quickly as possible and fix them.
Yeah.
And that's what we humans do, right? We
Hmm.
are here to solve problems, and we are solving problems because we make mistakes, or things change in ways that we weren't expecting, and we have to adapt to it. We have to learn from it. We have to be resilient. And so we celebrate it here. Like, okay, it was a mistake. Now let's figure out how we're going to fix it and
Right.
be better because of it. So
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
a different way of looking at mistakes here than I think a lot of organizations, where we celebrate it and encourage it. Like, let's just figure it out as fast as we can.
Right, right. And I think when you have a culture of doing that, it prevents small problems from becoming a big
Yeah.
catastrophe. Like, we
Yes.
don't want big failures, but
Exactly.
I think when we have an openness, and
Hmm.
I don't know if you're being an engineer, Carrie, even though you said you're not really, but I think that mindset, it's not that that engineers are the only ones that can do this, but when we get into problem solving mode,
Hmm.
and we think forward instead of looking back in a
Yeah.
blaming sort
Yep.
of way, I think looking forward and saying, okay, well, how are we going to learn from this is
Yeah.
so powerful.
Yeah. And I think that really comes from, the place that I was at, hitting rock bottom and being able to rebuild my life, and in learning how to not have shame and regret and self-hatred because of
Hmm.
it. And so I think that helps me lead in that way, where it is about problem solving. And
Yeah.
yes, and that's why the name of my podcast is Reflect Forward, right?
Yeah.
You take what you learned from the decisions that you made up to this point, and how do you use that to fuel you going forward. And those are the
Hmm.
successes that you have in life, and those are the failures that you have in life.
Hmm.
And that is what the human existence is about, right? It's about growing and expanding and learning, and we can't do that by doing everything perfectly, by never making a mistake. If we live that way, then we're not taking risks, we're not living our lives for us, we're not going big and making the impact that we're supposed to, whatever that looks like for any of us. And so yeah, so I think that's how I've lived my life, and that's how I approach problem solving.
Hmm.
I actually just put out a podcast on, right, how do you root out problems as quickly as possible and solve
Ah,
them, because that is what this is, what leading is about. It's
mhm.
about effective problem solving, and it's about reflecting forward. How do we take what we learned and
Yeah.
use it to fuel us going forward?
Yeah. So I will I will put a link to that episode in the show notes and
Okay.
encourage people to check out Carrie's podcast, Reflect Forward. I'm sure you can find it wherever you're listening to this podcast, and I will go check that episode out for sure. So podcaster to podcaster, I sometimes like asking podcasters about podcasting mistakes. I mean, I have my own, if you will, favorite mistake stories as being a host. I'm
Yeah.
curious, do you have one that you learned from as a host or as a frequent guest on podcasts?
Yeah. Yeah. I love podcasting. I did it, I love interviewing people, and I love storytelling and pulling people's stories out of, and so it's so much fun for me. It's turned into so much more than I ever imagined. But one time, I have it where you can apply to be a guest on my show. And so this gentleman applied, and he had all kinds of really interesting backgrounds and done interesting things. And so I was like, yeah, I'll just bring him on. But I didn't vet him. And he was the most egotistical, like me. I mean, just so opposite of everything that
Yeah,
I'm about, everything that my podcast is about. Like, there was
yeah,
no possible way I could put this podcast out there.
yeah,
And so that was a huge mistake. And because then I had to tell him, like, at the end of the interview, I just don't think that this is the right fit. And he was very, very angry with me. Exactly what I was expecting, but I
yeah,
made the right call. I didn't put it
yeah,
out there because it wasn't aligned with my brand. And so I vowed I was never going to not vet another guest again. And
yeah,
so that was really tough, because I hated having to have that conversation, but it was my
yeah.
fault. I didn't do enough vetting. So that's mine. How about yours? What's yours?
Well, I was going to ask though. I mean, I'll share a story, but I mean,
Yeah.
when it comes that vetting, is that just even a matter of having? I mean, I always do a pre-call. You and I did a pre-call.
Yeah.
I think for one, to make sure guests aren't surprised.
Yeah.
Here's my mistake. And I'll come back to what you learned from yours. Is don't let the guest be surprised that they're going to be asked, "What's
Yes.
your favorite mistake?"
Yeah.
I learned generally this would happen if the communication went through a PR firm, and I'm not trying to knock them, but and if we didn't do a pre-call because the guest was busy or important, and then they showed up and they're like, I thought I was going to answer the same 5 questions that my people tell every guest to ask. And so instead of I'm not blaming the PR firms. What I've learned is I need to take responsibility for that connection,
Yeah.
and a pre-call makes that clear, and people are like, oh, I'm going to have to think about that, and like, that's why we're doing the pre-call. But if there is no pre-call, like even just email connection and like getting that confirmation, or I've learned the very worst, before we start recording, to check in on that. And if they don't have a story ready to go, say, I think it would be better for everybody involved
Mm-hmm.
to give you time to think about it. Let's reschedule. So that's a mistake I've managed to not repeat. But I mean, I think the first time I made it though, I let the person struggle through, and it took me a while, and then I was in the position of like, I didn't cut it off soon enough. I don't know if
Yeah.
you felt that way about that
Yes.
guest in that scenario of like 5 minutes in, you're like, oh, I should just pull the plug on this.
Yeah, I didn't do that either. I went through the whole thing miserable, going like, "Oh my God, this is awful." Like, oh yes, yeah.
Did it show on your face if you go back and look at the video?
Oh gosh, you know what? That's interesting. I do not have a good poker face.
Me
So,
neither.
but I doubt that this person paid attention.
No,
You
no,
know.
but I'm just out of curiosity of like, could you have a laugh at your reaction?
Oh God, I know.
Did you
I should actually go
cringe or
back.
look away?
I should go back and look at it. You're right. I didn't go back. I just like I can't. I can't. I
Yeah,
can't.
but
But I should. I should, because I never want to make people feel awkward when I'm just like. So
yeah.
I should go back and make sure that I've got a good face. But yeah, sometimes it's hard, like when guests drone on and on about things,
Mhm.
and to, like, just figure out like how do you interrupt in a polite way to be able
Uh-huh.
to say, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Or do you just let them keep
I,
going? I don't know. Those
I
are
need
the tough ones for me.
I need to get better at that because we're raised in the Midwest and it's not
Right.
polite to interrupt. And then you listen to professional interviewers and look, sometimes you have to. I
I
mean,
know.
I want to give people space to tell their story, but
Yeah.
I have tried to remind people, this is not a TED talk.
Right.
So, 20 minutes uninterrupted is not what we're going for here.
Yeah,
But
we're having a conversation here. Let's have a
yeah,
conversation.
yeah. And I think we had a really nice conversation here. So to wrap up, our guest again has been Kerry Siggins. You can learn more about her and her book and her podcast at kerrysiggins.com. It's Carrie with a K. There's a mistake people could make with the spelling of
That's
Carrie.
right. Yeah, yeah.
Kerry Siggins. There's a link in the show notes. I encourage you to check out the podcast, which is Reflect Forward, and the book is The Ownership Mindset. So, Carrie, thank you so much for taking time out of your CEO day for being a guest here on the podcast and for sharing your story. I
Thank
really
you.
do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been lovely to be on the show.
Thanks.